Just cross our fingers and hope for the best. All right, so last class we stopped talking about price floors. Price floors are the legally determined minimum price that sellers can receive. So basically the government says like you cannot sell this good for less than this certain price. What it does is producers get some protection from market forces. Obviously, if you're selling something, you're going to prefer a higher price for it, get as much money as possible. They can't do that with the market forces, pushes the price down towards equilibrium. So what they do when we see a price floor is often these producers lobbying the government, trying to get them to pass a law that sets prices higher than equilibrium. And this benefit that the producers get, obviously, is going to be at consumers' expense. So consumers are now going to have to spend more money and are going to be worse off. So the first example is price floor in the market for wheat. During the Great Depression, farms seriously struggled. So one of the things the government did in response was set prices for agricultural products higher than equilibrium. Once you start providing a benefit to a small group of people through laws, it's very difficult to repeal those laws. So these price controls are on the books to today, and they're still enforced by the government. So let's walk through, using the idea of producer and consumer surplus, what happens in this market, looking at the market for wheat. So if the market was in equilibrium, no laws with controlling prices, the equilibrium price would be $6.50 here. And the quantity that's being bought and sold in the market will be 2 billion bushels per year. Right there, where supply crosses demand. At this point, consumer surplus is this whole area above price and below the demand curve. And producer surplus is going to be this area between the price and the supply curve. When we're in equilibrium, remember we're maximizing both producer and consumer surplus. So they're both being made as well as possible. Additionally, the marginal cost and marginal benefit at this point, this equilibrium point, are going to be the same. So in this case, $6.50 is the marginal cost of producing that last unit, and it's the marginal benefit to consumers for purchasing that last unit of wheat. So from an efficiency standpoint, this is perfect. This is what we want. But in this case, farmers have convinced the government to impose a price floor of $8, which is above equilibrium. So now the price that's being bought and sold at has to be $8. So no matter what, even if farmers are willing to sell for a lower price, they're not legally allowed to. So the price is going to be $8. Well, right here, where the demand curve crosses that $8 price, is going to be 1.8 billion bushels per year of wheat. It's going to be less than in the original equilibrium because there's a higher price. So all the consumers between here and here, their value of between $8 and $6.50, they're no longer going to be purchasing that wheat. It's not worth it for them anymore, even though it was in the past. But at the same time, at the price of $8, firms are willing to produce, or farms are willing to produce, until the marginal cost of production equals $8, this new price. So where that $8 crosses the supply curve, so way over here. So it's going to be like 2.2 billion bushels of wheat per year. Again, because they're seeing that they can get $8 for each bushel of wheat, they're going to produce until it costs them $8 to make it. So what we end up with in this case is a surplus. We have all this extra wheat on the market that consumers are unwilling to buy at this artificially high price, but the producers are more than happy to produce because they think, and the ones that are able to sell their wheat are able to get enough money back for it. Now turning to the idea of producer and consumer surplus. Remember before, this triangle, A and B, these were all consumer surplus. Now this area, represented by rectangle A, is now producer surplus. That goes to producers from consumers. The difference between the equilibrium price and now the new price that's being sold. So producers making themselves better off at the expense of consumers who are now not as well off. And then we have these two areas, B and C, these triangles. Remember, these are transactions that are not taking place. In equilibrium, we have 2 billion bushels being sold. Now we only have 1.8 billion being sold. So all the transactions that would have been taking place in here, they're no longer taking place. So it's a dead weight loss in the economy. That's not going anywhere. So producers lose it and consumers lose it. So now we've got this dead weight loss, all these transactions, 0.2 billion bushels a week that aren't taking place, that could have taken place if the market was in equilibrium. We also have a bunch of extra wheat that has not been sold. So what's happening here is that these firms, we're looking at from the view of the entire economy, they're wasting resources on producing wheat. They could have used those fields and those, I don't know, big tractors and stuff to produce something else. It could have been hemp, it could have been flowers, it could have been other grains, other types of food. There's all these alternate uses that they could have used it for that people or consumers would actually benefit from. But they're not, because they're getting this price signal that, hey, consumers are willing to pay $8 for this because they're legally required to if they want to buy it. So we end up not only having this dead weight loss, areas of B and C right here, these transactions not taking place that could if they were allowed to. We also have the wrong goods being made, things that are making consumers better off, that could make consumers better off. Does this make sense to you guys? What's going on here? Yeah, so we're taking this idea of producer and consumer surplus. Give that one example last class of when price is too high. And we said that over time, say they set the price at $8, not knowing what equilibrium price is, competitive pressure is going to push it down towards equilibrium. In this case, because there's a law preventing it, we're never going to reach equilibrium in this market. Now, another thing that happens, got this written down somewhere so I wouldn't forget it, is what happens with all this extra wheat? In real life, what do you guys think happens with this extra wheat, or any like farm stuff that's left over?
I think doesn't the government buy it because they don't want the market to be flooded?
In some cases, they buy it. Do you know what they do with it when they buy it?
To be honest, my grandpa didn't tell me.
You what?
My grandpa was a farmer, so he didn't tell me what they did. He just told me they bought it sometimes, so he didn't get the market flooded.
Who buys it from? Is it the USDA?
They go. You know? So basically, they'll pay you to not farm that year, so you just get paid to do nothing.
Yeah.
So
that's another example. One is they pay you. You have these fields. They pay you not to do it ahead of time, so we don't end up with this situation where we have a surplus. And I hate that they didn't put the 2.2 right here and factor across this to make it more obvious. So instead of having this surplus, allowing that to persist, they just pay people not to do it, so they can get what they think is going to be equilibrium, or at least closer to equilibrium. They also buy the grain from them, or whatever agricultural produces. When this started during the Great Depression, they would throw it in silos that the government owned, and it would just sit there and rot. This is the Great Depression, where we have food lines, people, 25% at the peak, people out of work. Standing food lines, not having enough food to eat, and we're literally buying food and destroying it, or like letting it get destroyed. They did the same thing with pigs. The price of hogs were too low, so they artificially raised the price. Government slaughtered a bunch of pigs and just let them rot instead of somehow figuring out to get them to people. Yeah, so in 1996, Congress passed the FAIR Act, I forget. In the 90s, they started using those weird, corny acronyms. But they were going to phase out the agricultural subsidies and price controls. And they said it'll take place over 10 years. Unsurprisingly, I guess those farming groups, they lobbied and got the phase out postponed indefinitely. So we still have them on the books today. One of the things that made farming incredibly difficult, especially in the past, was that you would have to buy all this stuff ahead of time on credit. You didn't have the money laying around. So if you're a farmer, took a loan out from the bank, you bought all the seeds, you bought the equipment you needed for that year, paid for help to work the fields. And then at the end of the year, you would get all that money back when you sold the crops. But if the price was lower than the year before, than you anticipated, you wouldn't have enough money to cover all your loans. So you'd either owe a lot of money to the bank the next year and destroy your credit, or you'd have to go bankrupt. And we had a lot of financial crises in the history of the United States because of that, where we had a bunch of farmers not making enough money back, and the banks that were loaning them money failing because no one could repay their loans. So there were a lot of, the best way to phrase this while still being an economist, there were a lot of decent reasons, there was some good motivation behind trying to stabilize agricultural prices over a long period of time, to make it easier for these small farms to be able to remain in operation year after year after year. But there's a serious cost of knocking us out of equilibrium, causing these surpluses, wasting crops that are grown, things like that. Oh, there's the one that shows the surplus. Wish I would have remembered that. Yeah, so now we have the better idea. All of this right here, this is what is being supplied to the market. This is all the consumers are gonna buy. So this huge surplus right there. That's what the government somehow has to figure out how to deal with. Because again, you can't just have them flood the market and mess with the price when you have these price controls on there. All right, so the next example is minimum wage. This is in the news quite a bit now. So first time I've had to teach it while politicians are talking about it and people had more, strong opinions about it. So I'll try as hard as I can to keep politics out of this, but this one's gonna be difficult. So we can think of the labor market just like any other market. So the demand curve in the labor market is going to be firms. Firms, think of them as the consumer that want to purchase workers or work from individuals. Then the supply curve in this case is going to be the workers themselves. So supporters of minimum wage say this is a good way to raise income for low-income workers. Help them get enough money from their income so that they're able to live a decent life, have all the necessities that a person needs to survive and thrive in an advanced economy. On the other hand, opponents argue that you end up with fewer jobs, fewer opportunities for low-income people or low-income workers to get on that first ladder, first step of the ladder up, to higher incomes. Small businesses find it very difficult to deal with minimum wage laws, unlike large businesses. Amazon already pays $15 as their company minimum wage, and they're encouraging a national minimum wage because Amazon can afford it. Mom and pop bookstore that has 2 employees finds it much more difficult to afford higher labor costs. So if we look at minimum wage, look at what this price control does to the market, we can see it does decrease employment. So there's going to be some deadweight loss to the economy. Depending on the elasticity of the supply and demand curves in the labor market, deadweight loss could be larger or smaller. We're not going to make, at least during the lecture, any normative judgments over whether the cost of deadweight loss, the cost that results from minimum wage, outweighs the benefits to the workers that get higher wages. That's a different argument to be had. Right now, we're just worried about the mechanics of it. Okay, this is the only slide we have for this.
So a minimum wage, wouldn't the entire market, if you raise minimum wage by 100% basically, wouldn't that just raise everything else? All the prices of everything else?
Yeah, most likely you'll end up with increased prices just about everywhere because labor costs are a huge part of costs for firms.
Yeah.
Let's just draw this. I really like the supply and demand curve. And that's another argument against the minimum wage is that you increase the nominal wages, so the actual like numbers on the check you're getting. But if all the prices of everything else increases by the same amount, then you're no better off than before. You just feel better off. So in this market, and this is a market for a lower skilled worker. This isn't the market for accountants. Let's say the price or the wage is going to be, let's call it $7.50. Isn't that the current minimum wage nationally? Well, before we even get started, I just want to point out that national minimum wages are kind of a terrible idea because the cost of living differs so much across the country. Washington, D.C., Manhattan, cost of living there is super high. So if you set the minimum wage for them, West Virginia, Western PA, Alabama, they're going to be kind of screwed. You try to set it so Alabama, Mississippi, West Virginia, that it's acceptable for them. People in New York City or Washington, D.C. don't have enough money, to live. So setting it regionally, whether you base it on the cost of living or just let each state or locality handle it, allows you to adjust for differences in prices. This is going to be very different based off of what part of the country we're talking about. So that's something important to remember about this, but not important for what we're dealing with here. So we'll say the price in equilibrium for a low-skilled worker, some, I don't know, say a high school degree, $7.50, and there's 10,000 that desire an equilibrium. So let's say we pass a minimum wage of $10, keep the numbers simple. At $10 an hour, supply of workers is going to increase. Let's call that 12,000 people. Now that they're able to earn a higher wage, it's now more worth it for them to get a job. There's the idea of what's called reservation wages, or the minimum wage that a person would be willing to take a job for. Think about it. You get some government benefits when you're unemployed. Getting a job gets rid of some of those, so the wage needs to be high enough to get rid of that. Oftentimes people will sit and they'll wait for a better job to come along if they have the ability, they have some sort of income coming in. If the wage goes up from $7.50 to $10, maybe you're willing to work a place that has worse conditions, or that forces you to wear like a stupid uniform or something that you don't want to wear. I wouldn't want to get a job at Burger King, but if they paid me $100,000 a year, I'd be in there wearing the polo shirt, flipping hamburgers. That's a good salary. But the problem is at this higher price, let's call this 8,000, we're going to have fewer workers that firms are able to pay. Again, because they face a hard budget constraint, they can't just increase their labor costs. So in some cases, workers say they only bring in $7.50 of revenue to the firm. They have to pay them $10. They're likely to say, oh, well, it's not worth it. I'm losing money on this employee. So in this case, they won't hire them until the employee is able to bring in $10. $10 an hour in this case. So this area that was, let's do a different color so it's easier for you guys to see. This area right here. That was consumer surplus, so that was firms, the surplus they had from these workers. This is now part of the dead weight loss because these workers are no longer being hired. So firms are worse off from not having these employees. This area right here, dead weight loss from workers that would have worked at $7.50, but are now not able to get a job. Both of these areas, dead weight loss. I guess we'll stick with blue. This area that was producer surplus, now consumer surplus. Now, there's been a lot of talk from economists about minimum wages, whether they're a good thing or a bad thing. One of the things that some economists in favor of minimum wage increases have mentioned is that this area right here is larger than the deadweight loss, or they estimate it to be larger than the deadweight loss. In this case, they say, despite the costs associated with minimum wages, it's worth it to pass a minimum wage. The costs outweigh the benefit. Others say, no, we believe the deadweight loss is larger than this benefit that's to workers making more, making a higher salary. So that's where the debate has been centering right now.
If the benefit was greater than the loss, why wouldn't equilibrium actually go to that point?
Because you still have workers in this deadweight loss area that are willing to work at the lower wage, $7.50. So remember we talked about equilibrium, how society is as well off as possible. Right here it's $7.50, society is as well off as possible. These workers, these 2,000 workers, are now being made worse off, and the firms that would have hired them are being made worse off. For these 8,000 workers that do have a job, they're now being made better off. So we're not increasing the sum total of economic surplus for society, but those people are being made better off than they were before, if that makes sense. But that is a good question. That's something like I would ask, like, well, if it's so good, then why isn't it happening? There are some problems with minimum wage. One thing is a lot of people that work minimum wage jobs are like high school kids or college kids. So by removing the lowest level job, people that aren't very productive, you're removing that first step for them to get some sort of employment history so that they can show it to like employees later, demonstrate the fact that they're able to work, show up on time, things like that. It disproportionately hurts low-income people, people without educations, that are the ones in this like 2,000 not getting jobs. And also you have these people, in this case 2,000 people that aren't working. So you need to provide some sort of government assistance to them. But on the other hand, you have people now making more money per hour, so they need less government assistance. Maybe they phase out, they don't need any government assistance anymore. So there are some savings. There are some costs and benefits. But these employment factors, these people that aren't working, is a serious effect that too often gets ignored. There's minimum wage research is very hard to do, to find people that are actually making minimum wage. So when economists try to study it, what they do is they'll pick like certain industries. So like they'll look at fast food industries and like the number of workers there, because a lot of them make minimum wage or very close to it. New Jersey raised their minimum wage, don't have it written down, somewhere in the 90s. And Card and Kruger, two economists, looked at what the effect was. They compared like fast food employment in New Jersey to Eastern PA, and they found actually an employment increase from the minimum wage law in New Jersey. Critics of the paper said it's like finding water running uphill in physics. This is impossible. You're not going to see an increase in employment when you make it more expensive. Subsequent research where they use different statistical techniques, they actually found a decrease in employment. But even where you don't find a decrease in employment, what you're likely to find, like firms aren't going to go ahead and fire people necessarily. They may just increase the prices that they're selling at. What they end up doing is hiring less in the future, stripping away other benefits, decreasing the hours that the workers are working. So, the dollar per hour going up, but the total salary isn't. Fewer perks, making work just more difficult. So like fewer breaks, bosses really riding them instead of letting them, work more slowly. So there are other costs or other things that may make work less enjoyable, more difficult, things like that. So there's more margins than just the employment numbers. So it turns what seems to be a very simple debate into a very boring technical analysis. That there's a lot of things going on to consider. But yeah, something that's important to remember when we're talking about this that often gets ignored is this deadweight loss of these workers that are unable to work at a wage they're perfectly willing to, and firms that are unable to hire these people at a wage you're more than happy to hire them at. Here's an email. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Can you assume that when the minimum wage rises and unemployment's going to increase?
Not necessarily. That's the most likely outcome. But like I said, firms may not just fire workers. They may hold on to them and reduce hiring in the future. So employment may stay the same. Odds are it's going to increase because a mom and pop bookshop may fire a worker.
Yeah.
But if you look at like employment growth over time, you would see it like slow down like relative to the trend before that, as they're just not making new hires.
So then couldn't like the amount of people applying for like government assistance programs increase too, and it ultimately increase taxes?
That's likely in the long run. This was an email sent out from some school in Arkansas. And circle at the bottom, they said, please know your department budget for the UCA, so it was Central Arkansas, student help and federal work study will not change due to minimum wage increases. Please make adjustments to stay within your budget. So this is an example of a university where the minimum wage increased. They basically told them, we're not giving you more money, so basically require them to either fire workers, like the student workers for them, or cut their hours. So it ends up costing them the same. Okay, so now let's move on to rent control. Do you guys even know rent is too damn high guy? He would like run for office in like New York City. This is a while ago, and his party was called the Rent is Too Damn High Party. If you guys watch Rick and Morty when they went to like the Citadel of Ricks in season 2, they had the one Rick that looked like just like this dude. So we'll look at rent control. This is, again, a price ceiling, so this is the opposite of what we were looking at in the previous 2 examples. So basically, price ceiling, limit to what producers can sell their good for by law, so you cannot charge above a certain price. So it's set below the equilibrium price, so that consumers don't have to pay as much money. So let's look at this market for apartments. We're saying this area that the equilibrium rent would have been $2,500 a month. So this is like a big metropolitan area like DC. Equilibrium quantity of apartments at that price is 2 million. And again, at this price of $2,500, the marginal benefit to consumers or to renters of that last apartment is equal to $2,500. The marginal cost of production, so building and maintaining an apartment building, is $2,500. So everyone that wants an apartment at that price can rent one, and every landlord that wants to rent an apartment at that price can rent one. So our market's in equilibrium. We've maximized producer and consumer surplus. So consumer surplus up here and producer surplus down here. So now let's say, because rent in this market is expensive, the city government passes a rent control. They say no rent can be above $1,500 each month. What we end up with at this price is the similar but opposite thing that we saw before, now artificially low. So the supply of apartments is going to be 1.9 million, so less than we had before. Again, because some apartments are just too expensive to maintain. It's not worth it for landlords or for like big companies that like own apartments down like big cities. They're not able to afford keeping them up or making them. And again, if the price is only $1,500, they're only willing to supply when the marginal cost is less than or equal to $1,500. At this lower price, more renters are willing to rent a place. Yeah, now it's relatively lower, so anyone that values an apartment at $1,500 or more is going to be willing to rent. So you end up with 2.1 million renters willing to rent an apartment. So now instead of a surplus, we end up with a shortage. We now don't have enough apartments to go around. when I lived in Arlington for grad school, the cost of my apartment was a 2-bedroom. It was about $2,200 a month. It was the cheapest place I could find by far. The minimum, like anywhere else, was like 25, 26. So I would have loved to only pay $1,500 a month for that place. But we'd end up with a shortage of apartments. So it'd be very difficult. It would have been very difficult for my roommate and I, who both moved there from outside of town at the same time, to find a place. Yeah, so here we go. Producer surplus originally was all this. So this was what landlords, oh yeah.
What's the intended effect for this?
The intended effect is to make it easier for people to afford apartments. So apartments in big cities, obviously, like, very expensive. Well, I can just jump in and talk about it now. Yeah. This is from my money and banking class about what they call closed access cities. Closed access cities are ones that have strong zoning laws that make it very difficult to build new apartments. So in certain areas, they'll say you can only have single-family residence, basically all of San Francisco. Let's say you can't build buildings higher than, say, 3 stories. They'll dictate what type of apartments you can build, how long it takes to build it, so they reduce the supply. These big cities, so these examples, San Jose, San Fran, LA, San Diego, New York, Boston. Very difficult to build new houses there, but there's a lot of jobs there. So if you get a college degree, odds are you want to go to a place like that to work for, you know, a good company, make a lot of money. But the housing supply can't increase. But a lot more people want houses, so what's that going to do? Push up the price of houses, or apartments, everything. So this shows these cities over time. In 1991, you can't even see freaking colors here. The purple, like down here, were cities in 91. This compares the median home price to rent. Everyone moves like down here, all cities pretty much the same. By 2007, we get this like orange color, and we start spreading out. And these are like San Jose, San Fran, LA, New York City. By 2015, they're way out here. So what we have, this is the rent increasing more and more in some of these cities because you can't break into the market. There's, I don't know, 1 million apartments, and that's like all you have year after year, even though you have 1.2, 1.3, 1.4 million people trying to get places. So that's going to drive up the prices. Once they start driving up the prices of these apartments, people that live there for a long time that don't have a ton of money are going to get upset that they're now being driven out, and people trying to move there are upset they're paying so high prices. So you have local ordinances being passed trying to lower the cost. They're trying to do a good thing and help people move to the area, but as we'll see, it ends up having these adverse consequences.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, you know, because I figured that's what the intended effect was, but if you know you're going to create a shortage, I'm just confused why they would elect to do that rather than like rezone something so somebody can continue to charge higher and higher prices for their nice apartments and then just use those profits to build like low quality ones that are affordable rather than capping the amount of money you can make so you can't make more.
It seems like it would make a lot of sense to do that, but a lot of people don't understand it. There's the acronym called NIMBY, not in my backyard, where people don't want their neighborhood to change. They don't want apartments going in there. I follow a bunch of people from Silicon Valley, and they've been bitching about it like crazy lately. Just about how difficult it is to build and what that's doing to prices, and like the town or city council like not understanding that's going to increase, that restricting supply increases the prices. Some of them even arguing that if you build more apartments, it's going to drive the price up even more. If only they took my class. I'm kidding, I don't think that would convince them. They'd probably just laugh at me. Getting back to the idea of producer and consumer surplus, originally, this is producer surplus, below this equilibrium price. This area above the equilibrium price is the consumer surplus. We end up with deadweight loss again, B and C. The difference between the 2 million apartments that would have been rented in equilibrium and the 1.9 million that are rented now with rent control. So these are the people that could have had apartments if we didn't have rent control that aren't renting apartments now. They're made worse off. These transactions not taking place make the entire economy worse off. They reduce efficiency. rectangle right here, the difference between the equilibrium price and the rent control price for all the units that get rented, that goes from landlords to renters. Now, it's hard to have a lot of sympathy for landlords, I know. You rent off campus here, you can deal with some pretty mean landlords. There's some nice ones in town, but there's some pretty shitty ones too, so it's hard to have a lot of sympathy for them. But, I guess rather than focusing on that, think of more in terms of this deadweight loss. Of these people that are being made worse off, 100,000 people in this case aren't able to get apartments. And the long-term discouragement of building new apartments that results from rent control. So our direct effect is we have, in this case, 200,000 people that want apartments that are unable to get at this artificially low price set by rent control. But there's other indirect effects. So the first is discrimination. And by discrimination, I mean this in an economic sense, that they're using non-price methods of rationing goods. So rather than just paying, whatever the market price is, you now have to add something else. So some of it could be legal and ethical ways of non-price rationing. So it could be like how loud the tenant is or how likely they are to be. Things like how much they party. That would definitely annoy their neighbors. If the food they make smells, if they leave messes outside. Kinds of people you wouldn't want to rent or to rent from long term. Legally, this is okay, but there's illegal methods. So they could use a protected class, race, religion, age, and they don't want to rent to certain people based off that. They could use personal connections in order to get apartments. When there's a shortage, it's 200,000 shortage of apartments, you have to use your personal connection, the people you know, to try to get a place. The apartment I found in Altoona, not that there's a shortage, of apartments down there, but my roommate knew our landlord through someone from work. So we were able to find the place that way. When there's a pretty big shortage of apartments, you pretty much need some sort of personal connection in order to get into one of these places. Again, because you're unable to just offer a higher price, you need to be able to do something else. Know the right people, maybe illegally pay, so give them money on the side that's not officially part of rent, just pay them in cash every month too. Next thing that happens is there's an inefficient usage of housing. So obviously, you look at people willing to purchase apartments, they're 2.1 million. In equilibrium, these consumers right here, these renters right here, would not rent apartments. They wouldn't live on the street. They would rent with a roommate. If you offered me an apartment for, $100 a month, I'd be more than happy to live alone. Even if it was, the house I rent is 3 bedrooms for like me and one roommate. If you made it even cheaper, I'd be happy to live alone. But I have a roommate to, save on costs. If you have the price artificially low, more and more people will be willing to live alone when they don't have to. What you also get is, for instance, an older couple, they had 4 kids, they live in a 4-bedroom place. The kids graduated from high school, from college, they moved out. But now the place is under rent control, so it's really cheap for them. They're not gonna leave that apartment, go to a smaller apartment and pay more money for a place that's not rent controlled, when they can just stay there in their nice big place and have it cheaper. There's no reason to expect someone to do that. So we're not using the price mechanism to ration apartments like we could. So now you have the same exact type of family, 4 kids, 2 parents, that were looking for a 4-bedroom apartment. They're now unable to get that place because this older couple, just the 2 of them living there, are renting this place because it's so cheap. And again, you cannot blame them for living in a big place that has sentimental value to them, that also is cheaper than moving to a smaller place. Absolutely no reason to expect them to. So it encourages people to remain in apartments that no longer meet their needs, and prevents other people from finding apartments that actually do meet their needs. So as you can imagine, there's not a ton of 4-bedroom apartments in New York City or places like that. It also benefits long-run renters over these new renters. So if you're trying to move to New York City to get a really good finance job, you have to spend a lot of money for one of the few available apartments. Meanwhile, if you've lived there since the 1960s, you're paying, $500, $600 a month for an apartment that's been rent controlled since back then. I watched the original Law and Order. Not quite trashy TV show, but still kind of embarrassing to admit to a lot of people. There were several episodes of that show over the 20 seasons where someone killed over a rent control apartment, or where you had someone living in an apartment that was still $600 because they'd lived there since the 60s, or their parents had lived there since the 60s. These people benefit substantially from having these low prices locked in. New people struggle to find a place, struggle to get in. And ironically, in San Francisco, you have a lot of conflict between those two groups. The new people moving in that want to find an affordable place and not have to commute an hour and a half to work every day. And the people that have lived there for years that are annoyed by these new people coming in and complaining about high prices when they don't have to pay high prices. Also, investment in housing decreases. So, the marginal cost of the last unit being rented in equilibrium is $2,500. And rent control is $1,500 when that's the level of rent control that's enacted. So what we end up with is, because you can't get as much money for an apartment, they're not going to build apartments that cost more than $1,500 as their marginal cost. If they can't recoup that cost through rent every month, they're not going to be producing it. They're not going to be building these new places. So we end up with less new construction, even without zoning things that are preventing supply from increasing. And finally, the quality deteriorates. Oh, sorry, before I move on. Existing properties, and we see this sometimes in places like New York City, get converted from residential apartments to office spaces that are being rented because they don't have rent control in office spaces. So landlords realize, hey, I can make a lot more money if I just turn this into an office building. So they got the inside, make it an office building, make a lot more money from it. So again, we're reducing supply even more because they can make more money doing something else. They can afford to upkeep it. And that's the final one, is that quality deteriorates. If the rent of an apartment doesn't cover the cost of repairing it, landlords aren't going to be able to afford to repair an apartment. If they're losing money from just renting it out based off their mortgage payments and stuff, again, very difficult to pull money out of your own pocket continually to keep upkeep on an apartment. Because you see the price of, or the renting of these apartments, that cost stays the same, but all the other prices in the economy increasing over time with inflation. So it costs $100 for a plumber to fix, the toilet this year. 5 years from now, it's $120. 10 years from now, it's $130. It's slowly going up over time, but the landlord's getting the same amount in rent. So it becomes more and more expensive over time to do these repairs and stuff to apartments. Eventually, when things get really bad, landlords can't afford to upkeep the apartment anymore. They're not even making enough to cover the taxes and the mortgage payments, things like that. When that happens, they just abandon apartments. And we saw this in New York City. I think it was the 70s and 80s where this happened a lot, where you had very high inflation, so the cost of upkeep kept going up and up, but the rent was locked in through rent control. You had landlords just abandoning apartments and walking away at a certain point where they just couldn't afford to upkeep anymore. So again, this is decreasing supply in the long run. This is an article about a year ago from Reason. New York's rent regulations having exact negative consequences they predicted. So landlords couldn't, so New York told landlords they couldn't pass along reservation costs, so landlords stopped doing renovations. Again, if they can't afford to do that, then they're not going to be able to offer it. So we end up harming consumers with this. We kind of covered the best thing best result. So what you're trying to do with rent control, make it more affordable for people to get houses or get apartments. The best solution for that, lowering prices. This is the market in equilibrium. Let's say over time demand increases because there's a lot of new jobs. Demand increases, the number of units that consumers want to purchase increase. The price is also increasing. If there's a lot of residents that live in the city that want to rent but can't afford this new price, best thing to do is increase supply. Build more apartment buildings. In many cases, rent control is accompanied by very, very strong zoning requirements that make it very difficult to build new places. So you're locking in supply and you're pushing down the rent that landlords are actually getting, making it very difficult to increase supply. You increase the supply here, you increase the quantity being rented even more. And the price, in this case, happens to work out to go back to the same, but it pushes the price down from this artificially higher price, or from the price from the increase in demand. The final example, I saw this article yesterday for rent control in Berlin. I know it's a little difficult to read. Basically what happened, I'll run through what the law was. Any apartment that was built before 2014 had their rents frozen in 2019. So your rent would not increase no matter what. And tenants can also bring down the rent of an apartment they lived in for many years if they could convince a court that it was excessive, the word they used. Rents had been increasing in Berlin in recent years because, again, people are trying to move to the city. They really want to move to Berlin. But at the same time, the supply is not increasing. It made it very difficult to build new apartments. What they ended up doing was exchanging one signal of scarcity. So when there's not enough to go around, demand is higher, then producers are willing to supply at that price. What happens is price typically increases when we allow the market to function. That's a signal, an incentive for producers to produce more, bring more to the market, and a signal and incentive for consumers to economize, to use less. They ended up exchanging it for another, just the lack of availability and the long wait times to get new apartments. So, this figure right here shows the difference between rents in Berlin and the next 13 largest cities. So this line right there is 0%, so no difference. See, it was increased from slightly below up to about the same as those other cities. Once the policy was announced and it was enacted here in early 2020, the price plummets down to what the rent control was. So we have much lower prices that, or rents that landlords are receiving. Here we have the listings of new apartments. So the new apartments in Berlin that were not regulated, so post 2014, are this dark line that's increasing. And of course, the line showing the next 13 largest German cities is very difficult to see, it's like white, and it's lower than there. So we had more going on, more apartments being rented, like the unregulated ones, increasing slightly compared to before. But what we see here is the regulated ones, dark blue being Berlin, light blue being the other cities, much lower than the other cities. So we have far fewer apartments that are regulated under this rent control. Because there's now this artificially low price, that the marginal cost is too high in a lot of these cases for the landlords to rent these places. So we're seeing fewer and fewer being rented, especially compared to the next 13 largest cities. So that's like a control group that didn't get the rent control in this case. So we see supply almost immediately dropping substantially. Okay, yeah, and I pointed out the closed access cities about how they restrict supply. So we'll end today with gas lines from the 1970s. I don't know if your parents or your grandparents have ever bitched about gas in the 1970s. Have you like heard the shitty stories? There's a picture of gas lines at like a gas station. People just standing and idling their cars, waiting in line because there was not enough gas to go around. OPEC, the oil-producing countries of the Middle East, they formed a cartel in like the 70s, and this was the first time they like flexed their muscle. What they did is they restricted output, primarily because they were upset at the U.S. for overthrowing the democratically elected president of Iran. They were also, trying to increase the price for themselves so they had some benefit, but also pay back to the U.S. for that. So what we ended up with was very high gas prices. They tried to use price controls to prevent the gas prices from going too high. There was already massive inflation in the economy leading up to this, so this only made it worse. So Nixon and Carter didn't want inflation, and Ford, I guess, was in there, didn't want inflation to get too high. So what they did was try to cap these prices. So we had to ration using other methods. One method that was used was you could only buy gas every other day. So if your license plate ended with an even number, you can go Monday, Wednesday, Friday. If it ended with an odd number, you can go Tuesday, Thursday. Something like that. All right, so here we have oil embargo. There was a decrease in the supply. They're selling less gas on the world market, shipping supply to the left. What we end up with is a higher price and a lower quantity being sold. But they tried to use price controls to prevent this from happening. They tried to make it easier for consumers, don't want people to have to pay too much for gas, so we'll just cap the price at a certain increase. But this had consequences. Oh, the link doesn't work. That sucks.
For what supplies there are, pressure is building again in Washington for a new look at gas rationing. There are reports that President Carter will urge Congress to reconsider the rationing plan they rejected this spring. Tonight, is gas rationing
so
the
they
answer?
had Congress trying to figure out
first,
who's
for
going to
those
get
of you
gas,
who've
how
been
much
spared
gas
the
people
experience so
can get,
far,
instead of using
I
market
want to
prices.
share the emotions Americans are feeling on the gas lines. Late last week, independent producer Phil Garvin spent a day on a line at a service station in Queens, New York. And this is what happened. As has become common in many states in the East, cars have been lining up before dawn. By the time the pumps opened, many had been waiting 2 and 3 hours for gas.
I've been here since 4:30 this morning. It's ridiculous waiting online here. I couldn't get gas Tuesday. The block was
You're like
about,
10 minutes on,
the line was about 8 blocks long.
Later on, there's some guy, very stereotypical New York accent, just going off on the reporter about how shitty this is and how terrible this is. A quick video from our director talking about what was going on with gas prices. What Congress was trying to do.
I am today ordering a freeze on all prices and wages throughout the United States.
In August of 1971, in an attempt to control inflation, President Richard Nixon simply declared that price increases were now illegal. Soon after Nixon's declaration, the situation in many markets started to look like this. The market equilibrium price was above the current price, but it was illegal to raise prices. Prices were hitting the ceiling, the maximum price allowed by law. With a price ceiling, buyers are unable to signal their increased demand by bidding prices up, and suppliers in turn have no incentive to increase the quantity supplied because they can't raise the price. The result is a shortage. The quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied. For example, a In the 1970s, price ceilings on gasoline meant that it was common to have no gas at the gas station. However, the story doesn't end there. More people want to buy gasoline than there was gasoline available. So who gets the gasoline? Rather than compete for gasoline by bidding up the price, buyers now competed by waiting in longer and longer lines, in effect, bidding up their time. In the 70s, people would wait for hours at the gas station to fill up. So while the monetary price of gasoline doesn't rise, the price paid in people's time did increase. Moreover, when buyers pay for gasoline with money, the seller gets the money. When buyers pay for gasoline in time, the seller doesn't get the time just gets wasted. Do you recall from the previous videos how the price system coordinates the actions of thousands of people all over the world in order to deliver flowers? Well, with price controls in place, the economy became discoordinated. Shortages of steel meant that construction workers had to be sent home and new building construction delayed. Factories and offices had to close when shortages meant they couldn't operate, and when they closed, the firms relying on them had to close too. In perhaps the most ironic case, a shortage of steel drilling equipment made it difficult to drill for oil, even as the United States was undergoing the worst energy crisis in its history. And other odd things started to happen. In a market economy, when it gets cold on the East Coast and the demand for heating oil increases, entrepreneurs ship oil from where it has low value, here in sunny California, and ship it to where it has high value, in cold New Hampshire. Buy low, sell high. With price controls in place, high-value consumers of heating oil couldn't bid up the price, and so there was no incentive for entrepreneurs to bring oil to where it was in greatest demand. As a result, in the harsh winter of 1972 to 1973, people were freezing on the East Coast, even as people elsewhere in the United States had enough oil to heat their swimming pools. And then the chickens started to drown. A price ceiling had been imposed on the price of chickens, but not on the price of feed. Farmers realized that at the controlled price, they would actually lose money if they fed their chicks to fatten them up and bring them to market. So the farmers drowned millions of baby chicks.
Thanks, price controls.
The list of strange unintended consequences like these go on and on. In the next few videos, we'll dive deeper into price ceiling.
Oh yeah, I was going to talk about price gouging laws, but we'll talk about that. We'll start next class with price gouging laws, and then we'll move on